Howdy, everybody. So today we're going to do a very quick overview of the rise of Andrew Jackson. So kind of the Jacksonian era, kind of his first run at the presidency, how that goes kind of bad, and then his 2 terms as president. I'm not going to go too far in depth because we could spend hours talking about Jackson. He's one of the most flamboyant characters in American history. But we're going to go through it fairly quickly, just to kind of give you an overview of some of the major issues that Jackson dealt with. So Jackson first ran for president in 1824. And as you can kind of see, if you look at those pie charts on the right, if the presidency was won by a plurality, that means whoever got the most votes, Jackson would have won. But technically, it needs to be a majority. So if no one gets 51 or more percent, they have a runoff with the final 2 candidates. And this is where it gets shady, and this is where Jackson gets kind of PO'd. So apparently, you have Henry Clay making a deal with John Quincy Adams. This is known as a corrupt bargain. Basically, what John Quincy Adams and Clay decide is if Clay, who doesn't have enough votes to win, throws his votes behind John Quincy Adams, that'll push him over the 51%. And in exchange for his votes, John Quincy Adams, as president, will make Henry Clay the Secretary of State. Now, at this point in time, if you become the Secretary of State, odds are you're going to eventually become president. So it's kind of a thing you need on your resume to become the next president. Now, initially, Jackson accepted the loss. He's like, oh, I lost fair and square. But when news comes out of Clay's appointment, he clearly sees there was some sort of corrupt deal in his mind going on. Now, we're not going to talk about Adams' presidency, you can read about in the book, but some of the big events during Adams' term. So the American system, he sticks with this old idea of the American system, partially because Henry Clay is his Secretary of State. You get a tariff of 1828, which challenges the South, and that's going to cause a lot of big conflict we'll talk about a little bit later. The Barbary Wars, which is actually where the United States fights pirates from North Africa. You get various trade agreements, and you try to purchase Texas. So we try to get Texas. That does not go very well. Now, let's talk about Andrew Jackson, the man of the hour. So, I mentioned in an earlier video, in the War of 1812 war, Jackson hated the British. So you can kind of see here in this drawing, this is when Jackson, who made a lot of money during the Revolution when he was a young boy as a shoe shine for British officers, mouthed off to one of the British officers, and the officer slapped him in the face with the blunt side of his sword, leaving a permanent scar on Jackson's face, as well as a permanent hatred for the British. And this kind of defines Jackson's character, because it's from this point on that Jackson takes crap from nobody. You're either 100% on Jackson's side or you're 100% his enemy. He knows no other kind of measure. He either loves you or he hates you. And if he hates you, he'll do everything in his power to destroy and or kill you. So, on the flip side, as much as Jackson can hate and as much violence as he has in him, he is definitely a man of extremes. He's also a man of love. So he loves to the same extreme that he hates. So this is his wife, Rachel. And they love each other like nobody's business. This was his whole world. To kind of show you how much he loved Rachel. Another politician made some snide comment, made fun of his wife. So Jackson challenged him to a duel. Now, typically at this point in time, duels were kind of to restore honor. So people showed up and they kind of shot off to the side of each other to say, oh, we're men, we stood up and shot at each other. Hurrah. This one was a little bit different. Jackson was pissed, and the guy he challenged to the duel, the guy who made a sly comment about his wife, was the best duelist in the state and had already killed several men. So Jackson, not the best shot, even though he was a general. He was good at leading men, not so much at the actual shooting. Had to figure out a way to win this duel and not die and also restore his wife's honor. So he buys a big oversized coat. You can kind of see the guy on the right. That's supposed to be Jackson with his big oversized coat. Kind of turned sideways to make his silhouette smaller. And the coat button was kind of the target most people shot for, because that was right about your main internal organs. But since he bought an oversized coat, it was going to stick out a little bit, it was going to be off center, so he hoped that it wouldn't hit him in anywhere vital. Now Jackson, knowing he wasn't the best shot, waited. When the duel came, instead of trying to draw real quick and shoot and get the other guy before it gets him, he's like, I can't do that. And he knew the rules of the duel were until both people shot, you couldn't reload. So he figured the other guy's going to draw and shoot, and that he can stop, take his time, and shoot him dead. So on the day of the duel, they line up, they pace off, they turn around, and the other guy draws real quick and shoots. Jackson doesn't flinch. The other guy's like, what the hell? Like, I thought I hit him. Like, I've never missed. And Jackson doesn't bat an eye. Now, it turns out the bullet hit Jackson square in the chest. It was, millimeters from his heart. He'd cough up blood for the rest of his life as a result of the wound. But he took a bullet to the chest and didn't blink an eye. Then he proceeded to raise his own pistol, slowly aim it, the other guy having just to stand and wait, and he shoots the guy dead. Now this is Jackson. This is a guy trying to become president. He can take a bullet to the chest, not blink, and keep on going. So this is a tough son of a gun. To kind of show you another extreme of Jackson, at the Battle of Caloosahatchee. This was when Jackson was in Florida and the surrounding areas fighting Native Americans. Well, they had a big fight with the Native American tribe, killed many of the people, practically a massacre. And after the battle, Jackson hears a baby crying. And Jackson, a man of extremes, he was willing to massacre pretty much this whole town. But when he finds his baby, he picks it up and adopts it. And that becomes Lincoya Jackson, so one of Jackson's adopted children. So, man of extremes. He can fight and kill Indians, but then also adopt one as his own son. So, very much, a unique guy for the time period. So, in reaction to the corrupt bargain, Andrew Jackson and his supporters, Martin Van Buren and John C. Calhoun, these are kind of his right and left-hand men, are going to spend the next 4 years of John Quincy Adams' presidency building a new political party, the Jacksonian Democrats, to crush John Quincy Adams. They call him names, they attack, they do all kind of horrible things attacking John Quincy Adams for the next 4 years, all preparing for the next election. So you get this new political party being formed by these three guys, and this is the Democratic Party we have today. Not the same ideals that we have today, but once this Democratic Party gets created, in some form or fashion, it'll evolve into what we have today. This brings us to the election of 1828. This is where Jackson and John Quincy Adams go at it. They duke it out, and it turns into a bloodbath. They are just name-calling, insulting each other. The actual politics don't matter. So to kind of give you an idea, Jackson and his guys call John Quincy Adams a pimp because John Quincy Adams had been our ambassador to Russia, and Jackson and his guys claimed that John Quincy Adams obtained and sold young American girls to the Tsar as prostitutes, basically pimping them out, trying to make him look bad. On the flip side, Adams and Clay called Jackson a murderer, that he had killed all these different people in duels and in war. Now, this wasn't uncommon at the time, but they're also saying, do you want a murderer as your president? Now, the final blow that's going to decide basically the next few years and how all these politicians relate to each other is going to be the final point, the final piece of the puzzle that Clay thinks will destroy Jackson. Jackson and Rachel had been married for a while, but Rachel had been married before. Now, Rachel had gotten a divorce, and then she and Jackson got married, and everything should have been okay. But someone at the courthouse didn't file the paperwork quite right, and technically she was still married to her old husband for, a few months or a year or so while she was married to Jackson, technically making her an adulteress. And this is what Henry Clay published in the newspaper, calling Jackson's wife an adulteress, ridiculing her, and Jackson's like, you call me names, call me a murderer, do whatever you want, but don't talk about my wife. And this makes him pissed. Now, he does his best to insulate Rachel from any of these attacks. He basically keeps her at their plantation, the Hermitage, and isolates her. So she never hears about any of this stuff. So when Jackson wins the presidency, Rachel is not too thrilled. I mean, she's happy he won, but she's not happy about being first lady. But she's like, okay, I'll support my husband. So she says, I need to go into town, go to Nashville, Tennessee, and buy a nice dress. And she goes into town, steps out of the carriage, hears a crunch underneath her feet, and looks down and sees a newspaper with one of the headlines calling her a whore, an adulteress. And she is overwhelmed by the shock at seeing this and passes out. Then, due to other complications, she ends up dying as a result of this. And in reaction to this, Jackson says, may God Almighty forgive her murderers. I never can. So he says, a being so gentle and so virtuous, slander might wound, but could not dishonor. So he says, you can say what you want about her, but she was beyond reproach in his mind. And he loved her, but he blamed Henry Clay for murdering his wife, and he will go to war against Henry Clay as the next president. So Henry Clay becomes kind of enemy number one for Andrew Jackson. And for the next 4 to 8 years, Jackson will do everything he can to rip apart Henry Clay and all of Henry Clay's political ambitions. So Jackson gets sworn in as president. And normally after the president gets sworn in, they have a party with, politicians, dignitaries, famous people. Jackson, common man, kicks open the doors of the White House and invites everybody. Anyone who can make it to the White House is welcome. And they basically have a rager of a party. People are drunk. They are destroying the White House. The only way they get them from actually ripping down parts of the White House is they drag the beer and cider kegs out onto the front lawn so the people will follow the alcohol. Now, when other politicians see this, they are shocked by this. They are horrified at what Jackson has done and what he represents. What's worse is Jackson gets associated with something called the spoils system. This is whenever a new president comes into office, he gives out offices to the people who supported him. Now, usually it's high-ranking offices, but Jackson kind of does it more than ever before. Other people have done it, other presidents have done this, but Jackson kind of takes it to a new level, and he kind of gets blamed with creating the spoil system. And the real problem was, by appointing friends and supporters to these jobs, you may not be getting the most qualified person for the job. And if you're going to have an attorney general, you want them to be a lawyer. If you're going to have a surgeon general, you want them to have a medical degree. So you want someone skilled, but Jackson didn't always appoint those people. So Henry Clay is going to try to propose something called the Maysville Road Bill, which will build a road in Kentucky. Jackson's going to veto it, use his power as president, and say, no, that road does not cross outside of Kentucky, so the federal government has no job in paying for it. Now, he's doing this because he feels it's wrong. If it crossed between states, if it gone to Indiana and Ohio, maybe the government should chip in. But on top of it, it was Clay's bill, so Jackson sure as hell was not going to let it pass. Then you have what's called the Tariff of Abominations, that tariff of 1828 that was passed right at the tail end of John Quincy Adams' presidency. And this is going to weigh on the South. And they're hoping that Jackson, as a Southerner, will try to repeal this tariff. Now keep this tariff in mind, it's going to come up and bite everybody in the ass later on. So this is John C. Calhoun. Now he's going to write a document. This is one of Jackson's right-hand men. He's going to be in Jackson's cabinet. And he is going to write something known as the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, challenging this document. Now what this document says, challenging the tariff. So it's built on something called the compact theory of government, that there's an agreement between the states and the federal government for power, some sort of cooperative shared power. And this is also based from that Kentucky and Virginia resolutions that Jefferson wrote way back when we're talking about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans. So as we get the Constitution, all this, you get the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. Now it creates two major ideas: nullification. So if the federal government passes a law the state doesn't like, they can nullify it. And it toys with the idea of secession, that if the government passes a law, the state nullifies it, but the federal government tries to enforce it anyways, that state can then leave the United States. Now, very quickly, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, nullification, and secession are all found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. However, Southern states don't pay attention to that. Because someone wrote it, they think, oh, it's a valid legal argument. And what's starting here, what they're testing here, is the process of secession that will come about in 15, 20, 30 years during the American Civil War. So keep all this in mind. This is going to come back again in a minute regarding that tariff. Now, another big problem is Peggy Eaton and Fluoride Calhoun. Now, Peggy Eaton is the wife of one of Jackson's cabinet members named John Eaton. He's the Secretary of the Navy. Now, Fluoride Calhoun is John C. Calhoun's wife. I know, fluoride, not the most common name today. We think of fluoride about our teeth, not about a name. But Fluoride Calhoun is John C. Calhoun's wife, so the Secretary of State's wife. And since Jackson's wife had died, Fluoride is kind of the de facto First Lady. She does all the party planning and all that kind of stuff. Now, the problem was Peggy Eaton had a kind of bad reputation. She had cheated on her previous husband. He died at sea. Then she marries John Eaton. People thought she was kind of sleeping around and kind of a whore before she married John Eaton. But John loves her, marries her anyway. Jackson supports him because Jackson believes no matter what happened before, if you love her, you marry her. He's a romantic in that sense. Problem is, at this point in time, if someone who has a bad reputation associates with people who have good reputations, the people with good reputations are automatically tainted. So Fluoride and all the other wives in the White House didn't invite Peggy to the parties because they thought she would taint their reputations. Now this caused a huge big fight. Peggy feels bad, and Jackson kind of flashes back to all the names his wife was called. And he thinks he has to protect Peggy, and this becomes a whole big issue. So instead of dealing with politics, they're fighting about whose wife gets to come to what party. So you have John Eaton and John C. Calhoun, both cabinet members, getting yelled at by Jackson to fix the problem. This is when Martin Van Buren, the vice president. Now Van Buren is a bachelor. He's unmarried. So he goes to Jackson, whispers in his ear, hey, maybe just get rid of the whole cabinet unless they invite Peggy, an ultimatum. Either everyone gets on board or everyone's out. Now he's thinking strategically because, like I said earlier, in an earlier video, or I think earlier in this video, if you become Secretary of State, you're probably next in line to become president. Well, that was John C. Calhoun. However, if Martin Van Buren can kind of stick a pry bar and get John C. Calhoun out of the cabinet position, out of the Secretary of State position, that leaves Van Buren as the next in line for the presidency. So Jackson issues this ultimatum, and Jackson's going to have a whole brand new cabinet because John C. Calhoun and his wife Fluoride won't invite Peggy to the parties. So Jackson kicks everybody out and has to start from scratch with a brand new cabinet. And this makes him look bad and derails his whole term as president. Now you had said, I'm going to be a one-term president, I'm going to get in, I'm going to fix everything, and that's going to be that. Well, that wasn't that. He's going to have to run a second time. So Van Buren got what he wanted, and he's the last man standing, the last right hand of Jackson. Well, things are going to blow up because John C. Calhoun, who wrote that exposition of protest, is now back in South Carolina, pissed that he got fired. So now they're going to start pushing this issue of the tariff. This is where we get the nullification crisis, where South Carolina actually nullifies in 1832 during the next election, nullifies the tariff of 1828, so this tax on trade goods. So they nullify it, and Jackson is pissed because it seems not only as an attack on the government, but as a personal attack on Jackson because he feels as president he is the government. So Congress does two things in reaction to Jackson. So when Jackson hears about this nullification, he marches down to Congress and says, give me an army. I'm going to march an army down to South Carolina, find John C. Calhoun, hang him from the first tree I find, and then force South Carolina to pay their tariff. So Congress gives him the force bill, which allows him to raise an army. But they give everybody an out, called the Compromise Tariff of 1833, which said we're going to lower the tariff back to the previous rate. And this kind of allows Jackson to back off if he doesn't want to use his army. So what South Carolina does, instead of nullifying or getting rid of their nullification, saying, oh, we were wrong, we shouldn't have done it, they nullify their nullification. So they're saying we have the right of nullification, but we're not going to use it right now. And this is the problem with the Southern way of thinking. They kind of retain and hold on to these ideas that are found to be unconstitutional, even after they don't work. And they're going to use them as a justification for the Civil War later on. Now, Jackson does back off. Since South Carolina accepts the Compromise Tariff, Jackson does not march an army in. However, if we look forward in life a little bit, on his deathbed, one of Jackson's regrets is having not killed John C. Calhoun when he had the chance. His second regret was not killing Henry Clay when he had the chance. So think about this. Jackson's like, I lived a good life, had a wonderful wife, had a good family. My only regrets are I didn't kill enough people. So, Jackson, he's an interesting guy. So, Jackson's second term. This one gets even heavier. Now, the next election, 1832, is all about what's called the Bank War. So you have Henry Clay on the right, convincing Nicholas Biddle, the head of the bank, to recharter the bank early. Now, Jackson hates the National Bank. He thinks it's corrupt, he thinks it's unfair, and it favors the wealthy over the poor. Clay knows this, and he thinks if the bank is rechartered early, Jackson will kill it, and if Jackson kills it, the American people would turn against him in the next election. So they do exactly that. They get the bank rechartered, or they propose it. Jackson vetoes it, and it goes before the nation basically as a referendum during the election. Henry Clay says, oh, Jackson tried to kill the bank. Jackson says, oh, the bank's the monster, I'll kill it. And this basically determines the elections. Henry Clay versus Andrew Jackson. Pro-bank, anti-bank. So Jackson versus Clay. Now there's a third party during this election called the Anti-Masonic Party. So if you've heard of the Freemasons, if you've read, Dan Brown novels or Da Vinci Code or any of those things, you've probably heard of the Freemasons. Well, at this point in time, many people think the Freemasons have this weird rituals and all this conspiracy, and they're secretly running the government, kind of like, the Illuminati, some sort of secret cabal running the government. And they're not completely wrong. There are a lot of Freemasons. George Washington was a Freemason, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, all the major people we've had so far pretty much all been Freemasons, but it was more of a men's club at this point in time than a secret, powerful organization. Now, were they powerful people and did they help each other out? Yeah, definitely. But this is kind of like a modern day attack on, powerful, the wealthy. It didn't go anywhere, doesn't really get much traction, but it does happen. So you can see very clearly, Jackson did not have a problem winning. Jackson took the election pretty solidly. And as a result, Jackson felt, well, I tried to kill the bank. People reelected me. That must mean they hate the bank. So it's now my duty to not only prevent the bank from being rechartered, but to kill it before I leave office. So how do you kill a bank? Well, banks are based on money, so you take out their money. So Jackson goes to Nicholas Biddle, and he says, I want you to take all of the federal government's money that's in the National Bank, take it out and put it in these handful of state banks. They're known as Jackson's pet banks. So Nicholas Biddle, knowing if he does this would kill the bank, he's like, no, I'm not doing that. That's a terrible idea. So Jackson fires him and replaces him with Lewis McLean. Well, McLean's like, yeah, you hired me to run a bank. I'm not doing that. That's a terrible idea. So they fire McLean. Then he hires William Duane. And Duane, also hired to run a bank, is like, nope, terrible idea, Jackson. You're going to ruin the economy if you do this. So fires Duane. Finally, he gets a guy named Roger B. Taney. Taney's like, I've seen what you did to the previous three people, so I'll do what you say. And Taney, as Secretary of the Treasury, will override Biddle and pull the money out and basically kill the federal bank. And it'll look great for a little bit, but as soon as Jackson leaves office, it's going to tank the whole economy. It creates a panic on the economy. Now, you see Jackson kind of have this spoil system continuing, people looking to Jackson to get benefits and favors. Jackson kind of using this slush fund from moving this money out of the national bank to kind of support different state banks, which is benefiting those particular states. And it seems like a very unfair system. Now, probably the single darkest moment in Jackson's presidency is going to be the Trail of Tears. The Cherokee, you see them in northern Georgia. They're one of the 5 civilized tribes. Now, the Cherokee had tried to assimilate into U.S. society, tried to dress like Americans, tried to act like Americans. They even went as far as buying slaves to fit in. They saw slave owners as kind of the pinnacle of southern Georgian society. So like, maybe if we own slaves, they'll accept us. The fundamental problem that all these Native American tribes experienced, the Cherokee in particular, no matter how much they tried to assimilate, the fundamental problem was they weren't white. They could dress the same, speak the same language, act the same, but they just weren't white, and as such, they would never be accepted. Racism was just simply too strong in the South at this time period. Now, the complication came when Georgians find gold in Cherokee land. They start moving in. The Georgians actually go before the federal government. They use the law. They go before the Supreme Court and say, they're invading our land. We have contracts. We have deeds that say this is our land. Stop them from coming in. And John Marshall, the guy on the left here, he's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules in favor of the Cherokee Indians over Georgia, saying the Indians are right. The Native Americans, the Cherokees, this is their land. Georgia, get out. Well, Andrew Jackson did not like that. So he tells the Supreme Court, John Marshall in particular, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. So whose job is it to enforce the law? The president. And John Marshall just interpreted the law saying Georgia is breaking it and they need to be removed. So it should have been Jackson marching an army in to protect the Native Americans. Instead, you get the Trail of Tears, where Jackson sends the U.S. Army in to forcibly remove the Cherokee Indians off their land, move them west to places like Oklahoma. So, not great. What's worse is what happens during this. They get started late in the season. They're not supplied properly. A lot of their food is rancid. A lot of the blankets arrive late. And vast amounts of people, thousands upon thousands of the Cherokee, are going to die due to bad conditions, rancid food, disease, all these kinds of things. This is one of the darkest parts of Jackson's presidency, one of the worst decisions he probably made. Now, Jackson recognizes the Republic of Texas. So Texas has gained its independence by this point, but he's like, yeah, I support you. So he's very good friends with Sam Houston, one of the first leaders of Texas, helped the Texas Revolution, became one of the first presidents. And Houston comes, Jackson's like, we want to become part of the United States. Texas has a lot of debt. It might lead to war with Mexico, so Jackson's like, I'll go halfway. I'll recognize you as an independent nation, but we're not adding you to the nation yet. We're not quite ready for that. Come back later and maybe we can do that. Now the final little piece, right at the tail end, after Jackson has retired from being president, someone tries to assassinate Jackson. So the assassin runs up, pulls a pistol on Jackson, tries to shoot him. The pistol misfires. Pulls a second pistol out, tries to shoot Jackson, and misfires again. Now Jackson, he's in his 70s. He coughs up blood on a regular basis. He has bullet wounds all over. He's carrying lead where he's getting lead poisoning, which is probably causing brain issues. Even in his late age and horrible condition, he still takes his cane and thoroughly beats the assassin half to death. Davy Crockett, one of Jackson's friends, was there during the assassination attempt, helps wrestle the assassin to the ground and have him arrested. So, even after everything Jackson's gone through, he is still, even in old age, a hardcore badass. So, this was our president, probably the craziest, most wild president we had. So regardless of what we think of any presidents in recent history, none really hold a candle to the wild nature of Andrew Jackson. So stop there for today, and we'll pick up with another lecture next time.